Blood satellite.
I'm going to make a crazy prediction. I'm going to make a prediction that I'm not even totally convinced of, but it's based off of a movement I'm seeing happening right now. So I talk about this on the latest episode of Real Secret Coffee Hours. That was just uploaded. That is our paywall show. That's on Patreon. That's on Gumroad, the premier destination for dissecting Substacks and ideological fights and feuds and things like that. But there was an article, a really interesting one, published by this progressive sort of civil rights think tank about Castizo Futurism. Because as an outsider saying what's going on in the dissident right, what's this thing called Castizo Futurism? And it was even quoting Nick Fuentes, the America First movement, kind of joking, but also not joking, because that's what those people do. That whole America First, what the Groypers do is they just say what they believe in an ironic, jokey way. But they were pointing out that most of the AF leadership at the time was either fully Hispanic or mixed Hispanic. And it was a joke. Oh, Castizo Futurism. What that means is that the future of far-right politics will be spearheaded by Hispanics. So by Hispanics, I mean sort of upper caste, pale Hispanics, maybe more European DNA than the fucking descendants of Aztecs, whatever it might be. And so we joke about that on our side, but what this article was doing was taking it very seriously by almost positioning whiteness and white supremacy as a virus that could infect South America and infect the various castes within those societies, of basically making the Castizos think that it could be Nazis. So, but has the interesting effect of locking white people out of the conversation of white supremacy and electing Castizos as the vanguards of white nationalism, while white people are just like not involved anymore. Like whiteness no longer belongs to them, whatever you think about that concept. But this is sort of like the migration away from like the WASPs, or what we might think of it. And one thing I noticed was, if you look at the policy proposals and beliefs of a lot of the groups that we've taken issue with recently, even these groups who don't like each other, who am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about the Vitalists. Those would be the Bronze Age pervert types. That would be America First. That would also be, I don't know what you would call them, but sort of the Richard Spencer, Rich Hanania, Walt Bismarck types, who are like former Wignat white nationalist types, who are making a case for being not even racist liberals, but they're trying to be liberals, and they're just denouncing white conservatism and the far right. You see that whole movement.
Yeah.
I mean, Hanani used to write for the fucking Daily Stormer, but then they did a heel turn later on. If you actually look at these groups who are dominating the press, who are pretty mainstream adjacent as far as these figures go, they actually have more in common than you think. The only thing they really disagree on is Jews. Whereas America First would be in here as well. They hate Jews, but they they believe in sort of a racial aristocracy. So do the Vitalists. And that's Richard Spencer's entire thing. He's trying to promote sort of Nietzschean aristocratic understanding of whiteness, of Europeanness. It's a whole interesting project he's got, but I'm like, you guys actually overlap more than you think. And I think if they could pivot a little bit on the Jewish question, and I think they will at some point, like that would bring together a lot of the most mainstream accepted or mainstream adjacent far right groups into one consistent thing that could actually represent the space. And some people think that's impossible. It'll never happen. You'll never get America First to side with the Vitalists. I'm like, hey, give it time. I'm not convinced Nick Fuentes really believes about fucking anything. How about that? I think if he
hasn't passed the ego death threshold there, so he doesn't actually believe anything. He can still be convinced and shifted. He's just playing a game right now, and he's a boy. So
I think, and this is something the Vitalists are going after by saying, look, there's bad Jews, there's Ashkenazi, but there are these cool based warrior Jews. I'm like, I think if you give them if you give them a type of Jew that they like, they'll absorb that. Because I got into a debate.
I bet I hate Jews more than he does, and I could convince him to love Jews. I could just sell him Bronze Age mindset in a one afternoon. I guarantee.
Here's what this is based on. I talked to 3 diehard Groypers recently, within the past like month. The last one, the third one, as recently as this week. And I present to them the case that Nick Fuentes, being the leader of the vanguard movement of, anti-Semitic misogyny, one of his few political efforts was trying to get a Jewish woman elected to Congress. I said, well, what do you think about that? And most groypers do the same thing. They'll deny it and say, well, show me the clip. Show me the clip of saying that. And I got the clips. I got all the clips. I show them. It's like, well, I've watched it, and I think I agree with Nick. I think, if you listen to him, he said that Laura Loomer, despite being a open Zionist then and now, so he said that she helped him a lot in his career, and he, if you're a good enough Jew, then I think, like he was basically saying that despite us being so anti-Semitic, if you're a Jew that we like, then we will not only accept you, we will advocate for you. So I'm like, all right, you've already built in the cope that there's almost exclusively Jews that you're going to help.
That, and I've never even gone into that with anybody, but that is such a funny thing because to him, Jew isn't a racial thing. It's like a political stripe. Because the fact that Loomer can just say, she can just tell you, I converted to Catholicism, and suddenly you will back her above anyone else in American politics, when she is like the Jewiest Jew of all. She's like the quintessential Jewish crone, and you are Mr. Anti-Semite. So to you, apparently, Judaism has nothing to do with race. It isn't a matter of the patterns of behavior that Jews as a biological creature exhibit. For me, that's the reason I hate them. I don't even hate Judaism as a religion. I mean, I hate it, but I don't hate it nearly as much as I hate Jews as a blood race of people who are incapable of, for example, telling the fucking truth or being trusted. Right? Like, the fact that you would trust her shows that this is just about stripe to you. It's just embarrassing.
So don't tell me that Nick Fuentes even really believes in his anti-Semitism that much, which
of course
is pretty much the only thing he's got going from that and saying America should be Catholic. I'm not even going to get into that, but so to me, I'm like, if he could tweak that a little bit, then all of these groups they can coalesce into one block. And then that could actually be the accepted, that would be the new alt-right. That would be because that's what Rich has mentioned. They'll want to go on CNN. They want to be invited to the big table. They want the big room. So
because it was never about actual action or succeeding at anything. It was just about getting pussy and making money.
Yeah, and so I'm like,
faggots.
That is how this Castizo futurism thing gets laundered. Because if you're just like, here's the thing: if you're just a white guy in America, and you believe white people exist and they should be allowed to exist, that's it. That's your first principle. You got two options. You've got Castizo futurism on one side, which is that we should let these very pale Hispanics lead us because they're the most virile and extreme. Or you've got the white Republicans who are still white saying that, aren't you excited that we have so many Hispanics around voting for us? Like they are, no one is more excited about legal migration from Mexico than Republicans. So if you're a white guy standing there, like, which one do I want? Do I want Mexican Nazis, or do I want the conservatives who are going to bring in regular Mexicans? Like you don't get a third option if you're a white guy just surveying the landscape. So you have to feel for that guy. The guy who's like, can I just give me someone to vote for who actually thinks I should exist? That isn't just trying to take my identity and say like, no, that's us now. You know what I mean? Anyway, so that's what I talked about in that recent episode. Pay attention to which discourses you're being locked out of. That's how this all started when we started discussing first principles so many episodes ago. It's like, all I'm doing is noting that you and me, and the people who've been on this tip for the longest time, people way longer than us, how many conversations are we being locked out of? And they're being adopted by these fucking weirdos who've got no priors and who actually want your dispossession. That old, like, again, that Sam High quote, when remember, these people want you raped, humiliated, humiliated, your children, raped, and they think it's funny. I'm like, these people are those people too. That's also Richard Spencer. Like, that's also Richard Hanania. He wants you fucking dead and molested and your kids transed. That's what they think that's funny. Also, the next bit of show news, it's that we had some really great live interviews lately, and these interviews do make it on the show during these episodes. I put them at the end of the episode for the Coprano Society, but we do live stream them now on our YouTube. If you didn't know we had a YouTube, Blood Satellite Clips, look that up. Look on the live streams. That's where I'm doing them now. So you can participate in that when we're doing them live. Usually it's a Tuesday night, Eastern Standard Time, but sometimes it's based around the guest schedule, so it'll be at a different time. But anyway, pay attention to our Twitter or Telegram. You'll find out when we're going live, and you could see them as they happen. The last few have been really, really good. The one you're going to hear on this episode, Space Age Maximalist, is one of my favorite ones, so I'm excited. Keep listening if you want to hear that. But that one was recorded a couple weeks ago. Also, check out the Vanguardist Journal, vanguardistjournal.com. That's on the .com, or it's on Substack as well, vanguardistjournal.substack.com. That's where we publish our long-form articles. I recently started uploading voiceover narration to them. These are pretty long articles, so if you want to just listen to a reading of it, like its own mini podcast, some of these are like an hour and a half long, you can do that now. So it'll be available at the top on the Substack. They're not on the Vanguardist Journal site right now, but I'm working on getting those uploaded. So check that out. If you haven't, if you're just like an anti-reading person, which you should be, now it's the greatest moment of your life. The most recent article was a pretty good one. I was pretty happy about. It was all about, it's called The Cult Imperialism of the New Patronage States. It summarizes a lot of stuff we've talked about on the show with the network state and basically how to build a parallel society, a parallel secret society. If you like the stuff we were talking about there, this is a one-stop place where it ties everything together in a pretty serious way. So check that out. There's this book I read recently that I really liked, and I wanted to cover this because it was recommended to me by someone we interviewed recently on the show, Fortisax. Fortisax, people might know the name.
My man.
Yeah, really popular guy. He's got a Substack called Fortisax's Typing. Great stuff. People are loving it. He would call himself a vitalist. But he is not a
really.
But he is
different.
He is different than what you or I might think. He's a pagan. Probably wouldn't even call himself a pagan. In the interview, he explains what he is.
I would call him a vitalist. I mean, I know the guy a little bit, and I would say he's what vitalism ought to mean to people who haven't read Bronze Age Mindset, and then for people who have read it, say, you can't, don't tar my 40 like that.
Well, that's the thing. So when I first heard vitalism described, I would imagine someone like him. And then I learned about what it really was. And I said, oh no. Oh heavens.
It's actually the gayest shit imaginable.
This is gay and dark. This is a fucking bathhouse with the lights out. Yeah! But he recommended this book called Archeofuturism. The author is, and I'm going to get this name wrong, and I shouldn't, but it's a Guillaume Faye, a French political activist.
However, we are not here to survey the Nouvelle Droit, but its second most famous member, Faye. He was one of the original core members of the Nouvelle Droit, but he split from them and mostly disappeared from view around 1985, only resurfacing with the publication of this book in 1998. In the meantime, he did things like radio comedy acting and starring in pornographic films.
So I looked at this like a good counterpart to our coverage of Reflections on Violence by Georges Sorel, because that was a book that was 20th century book discussing the internal collapse of the French left movement. Right, it was kind of all over the place. It was, at parts it seemed stream of consciousness. Great book, but it was a French leftist saying, "What the fuck happened to the French leftists?" And then this book is similar to that, except from the right perspective, saying, "What the fuck happened to the French New Right?" And it's really good, and the stories are actually very similar. But he said, "Look, Forsax has said, look, this is closer to what I believe in." Archeofuturism, sort of taking traditionalism but forward thinking. And so I wanted to read it because I didn't want people to leave our coverage of the Bronze Age mindset and the selective breeding book thinking that there's no interesting ideas emerging from this very, very expansive milieu. And there's a lot of stuff in this book that's parallel to the Bronze Age mindset. It's a love of Nietzsche, of Nietzscheanism, and of tradition and sort of a warrior spirit. A lot of the same notes are being hit here, but it's very different. And there's a lot of really good stuff in here. I'd recommend people read it, if only to get the whole first part of the book, which is like his view of what led to the collapse of the New Right and also the emergence of the National Front. So he actually talks about sort of the rise of Marine Le Pen in this too, as like something that was not good for the scene. So hearing it from a French perspective, I thought was very illuminating. He says, already the advancements made in technology and science, particularly in biology and computer science, can no longer be managed with modern humanistic values and ways of thinking. Already geopolitical and social events prior point to the tumultuous and violent emergence of problems connected to religion, ethics, food production, and epidemics. It is necessary to return to primary issues, hence the new idea I'm suggesting, Archeofuturism. This idea enables us to make a break with the obsolete philosophy of progress and the egalitarian, humanitarian, and individualist dogmas of modernity, which are unsuited to our need to think about the future and survive the century of iron and fire that is looming near. So one thing he establishes throughout the book, especially at the end, it's that technology is here to stay. We must reckon with technology. We cannot turn the clock back on technology. And he also says that sort of secular humanist egalitarianism is ill-equipped to handle technology. Like technology cannot be in place in the developments of just anybody, because down that way madness lies, right? So it's all like, if you are a traditionalist but you also believe in the inevitability of technological progress, you have to ask, okay, how can we harness this, control it? How can we make sure that basically the global south doesn't end up in charge of AI development?
Right.
He says, our current of thought, broadly conceived, must necessarily unite on a European level, forgetting about provincial disputes and narrow doctrines in such a way as to seize the opportunity that is being offered, to acquire the monopoly over alternative thought, rebel thought. Let us take advantage of the present global crisis and formulate suggestions that may stir the conscience of the young. And this is something that once I read it, it kind of brought some thoughts together in my mind, which is that this thing called the dissident right, what is the dissident right? It's just a rebranding of the alt-right. I actually like the term the alt-right because it's just alternatives. It's many alternatives clustered together. It's not a movement. It's not a coalition. It's not any sort of unity or cartel even, but it is just a conglomeration of interesting, new, dissident, rebellious ideas kind of clanging together in a mosh pit. That's what it is. I think what's most interesting about the scene is that if we play our cards right, and I think this is what makes us attractive to the types of people we were talking about before, the urban girls who are just looking for their next idea drug, that's what we are. We can have monopoly on every alternative to modernity. Sometimes that's futurist fascism, sometimes that's a fucking AI monarchy, sometimes that's a new type of pastoralism, but those things are all alongside us. They're not on the left, they're not in liberal spaces. We kind of do have a monopoly right now on the most revolutionary thoughts. So compared to when this was written, I think we're there, and we're still trying to figure out what to do with that. That's what we've won. That's why we are still rebellious, in my opinion anyway. He says, and he goes into that here. He says, to quote Renee Thorne, author of The Catastrophe Theory, only radical ideas can make a system plunge into chaos, catastrophe, or a traumatic change of state. in such a way as to bring about a new order. Radical thought is neither extremist nor utopian.
I would like to make clear that a catastrophe is not necessarily something negative. It is not the apocalypse. I use this word in the sense used by the French mathematician René Thom, who wrote a book, The Theory of Catastrophe. A catastrophe is a sudden change in state of a system that has been considered before stable, like our civilization, and which then plunges into chaos. A different order is then established after the chaos on a new basis. In this sense, the catastrophe is different from long-term decadence, like the Roman Empire, for example.
In order to shape history, it's necessary to unleash ideological storms by attacking, as Nietzsche correctly observed, the values that form the framework and skeleton of the system. So he's basically saying, like, the right, despite the left's monopoly on revolution, because when you think of revolution, you always think of leftists, you think of communists, right? I think one of the big transitions we saw is that the right has a monopoly on revolution, whereas the left sort of has a monopoly on, like, the status quo, the chaotic status quo. But they don't really have the language of change anymore, or at least it doesn't ring true. We have the language of change. We have the language of revolution now. And that means that we actually could attack the system. The leftists can't attack the system. They don't know how to attack the system. What are they attacking? That women don't have enough rights? It's weird shit. That's the whole Kamala presidency. They're trying to say, it's like, now it's time for a woman to take over. Okay, well, what's the woman bringing to the table? Well, we need to be woker. That's what she said.
We have to stay woke. Like, everybody needs to be woke. And you can talk about if you're the wokest or woker, but just stay more woke than less woke.
Right now is everything that you want. But you need to be right now, but more. I got news for you. That doesn't resonate with voters. It never has. People never vote on the status quo. They vote on change. That's why Obama was such a fucking carbon copy caricature, which is, he just said, hey, I'm change, I'm hope. Hey, you ever heard of change? Change is here. Change what? Well, it's about time. Hey, listen.
My wife was born a man, but she changed.
My wife was it's so great that everyone knows that, right? Everyone knows that Michelle Obama's a guy, but it's just like, even if you're a Democrat, you're like, yeah, maybe one day she'll come out. Michelle Obama standing there with his fucking legs splayed open like a guy on the subway, leaning forward with a coach's gait.
Oh, jeez.
All right. So the new right, in the tongue of the Frenchman, is the Nouvelle Droit. So he says, in brief, and this, he goes and gives a big list here. His opinion, what led to the fall of the Nouvelle Droit, because he left that movement, and this would have been the movement of the. So another figure named Alain de Benoit, who I believe we've read some of his books on here before, but quite a while time ago. He was sort of a figurehead, and still is a figurehead of the new right, but there was a schism which led to this, and then he published this book. So he says, in brief, the Nouvelle Droit has been confined to the periphery of the debate. Regrettably, it has turned into an ideological ghetto. It no longer sees itself as a powerhouse for the diffusion of energies with the ultimate aim of acquiring power, but rather as a publishing enterprise that also organizes conference but has limited ambitions. Sound familiar, right? And that's something that we've remarked on, maybe not on the show, but in this space that we're all in, this thing of ours, there are people that want to corral you into a content ghetto. And I think even leftists have this critique of leftists. It's like, do you want to change power, or do you want to endlessly critique power? Are you here just to rebel against whatever is in power? Or do you just like the mode of critique? Is that what you're in for? Arguably, that's what Zizek and a lot of these other people do. Like, I can tell your thing is just dialectical critique. You don't want anything else. So his argument with the Nouvelle Droit became just, you're an engine of criticism, but you don't want to harness any tools for actual change. You just want to be a publishing house forever. He says, I believe that the chief causes for this withdrawal are, and he is saying that, and this is something that I think they'll find a parallel here to our experiences over here in North America, which is that if you look at our spaces, the things we're talking about now used to have more prominence on the center stage, like race realism. Back when VDare and American Renaissance first started, VDare and American Renaissance used to be way more popular than they are now. It's not like they took a hit in their quality. They still publish good work, except VDare closed down recently. But there was a heyday of VDare where more serious people would read VDare. But what happened? Why did, these places end up where they are now, closing down? There's the, legal troubles they've been having, but, and Jared Taylor doesn't have his Twitter account, but we stopped being invited. We stopped being like an exciting powerhouse for exciting new ideas. That's what he's saying. So what happened in France, similar to what happened over here? He says, the competitive emergence of the Front National and of the thought of Antonio Gramsci, which was badly understood by the Nouvelle Droit. We used to see them as being bigoted, papist, reactionary, servile towards America, jingoist, and anti-European. That's the first thing. Number two, a tightening of censorship through a blacking out and closing off of the mainstream media, which followed the strengthening of ideological interdictions against all forms of alternative thought. The Nouvelle Droit submitted to these dictates, not daring to fight them through a creative, disorienting, and provocative reaction. The media, fascinated by the shocking political incorrectness of the Front National and its president, soon forgot all about the Nouvelle Droit. So basically, the Front National was more interesting, and the Nouvelle Droit became too boring and academic, and the censorship was on top of that. And we never fought censorship. We kind of do that on our side. We accept censorship. We've just accepted that we'll never be allowed to be popular again, even if we never say that outright. A lot of us kind of believe it. I think the daring few on the side understand, like, no, there's no reason why our ideas can't be popular. And we return to the simple fact that, look, we are fucking censored. We are suppressed. There was a time when we weren't. Early on in Twitter, early on in YouTube, we were very, very organically popular, and they need to keep us tamped down. And unless we don't buy into our oppressors' framing that we're schizophrenic, insane, and would not be welcome in popular society, we would be. Not all of us. Some of us are really just fucking schizos, but most of us would be okay. The number three, the third reason, the profound inadequacy of Nouvelle Droit publications with respect to current media communication strategies, combined with an editorial tactic that was hardly effective. The Nouvelle Droit has 3 magazines. The function of the first 2 of these, which are theoretical in nature, is to establish intellectual foundations. By contrast, Element, the chief media bridge, is badly positioned. While the analyses are often very sharp, and concrete practical theses and suggestions are lacking, other than let's open the debate, and I think this is interesting. It's like, okay, we have our magazines, we have our newspapers, we put ideas and discourse out there, but we don't give solid practical solutions to problems. That we just open up the floor to debate. What is to be done? Here's the problems. What is to be done? People don't find questions that engaging. They find answers engaging, even if the answer is extreme. People like solutions to problems. You can ask the question, you can point out the problem, but if you don't present a hard solution, even if it sounds kind of extreme, people don't even find that interesting, really. That's something we do on the right, I think, where we point to problems. Like, look, crime statistics, rape statistics, look, that's a problem. Well, what should we do? Well, I mean, someone's got to do something. People need to wake up. People are awake. What they want is a solution. Maybe even if you propose something very extreme, that's something they can latch onto. If you stop doing that, people don't even know what to do with the information you're giving them. That's why an advertisement needs a call to action. At the end of the advertisement, you can tell them all about your product. You can tell them the benefits, that you can sell them on the lifestyle. At the end of it, you got to say, here's where you can get it. You want to get it? Go get it here. Otherwise, you're just giving them a weird promise. You're giving them a feeling. People are frustrated when you just give them feelings. Give them something to do, and then they'll keep coming back to your fucking publication. I've never read any of these magazines, by the way. They might be great. They might be great, but he's saying, like, look, the readership's fallen off. It's inarguable that the readership's fallen off. So why is it fallen off? And he's given the answer here. So he said the Nouvelle Droit will only prove creative and credible once more if it manages to formulate disorienting doctrines. I love that phrase, disorienting doctrines regarding all major contemporary issues, and if it is able to establish a new ideological corpus on economic, scientific, geopolitical, and sociological matters. I think that's what we try and do in the Vanguardist Journal. It's that, look, we can get into theory and the history and these really highfalutin or trippy esoteric ideas, but at the end of the day, you got to leave people with how does this affect your life? You're the reader. You're reading this. You're consuming this. What are you going to do when you stop reading this? I'm going to send you off into the world. Should you do something? Should you ask yourself a question? Should you look at something differently? How can you... It's exciting teaching someone a really trippy idea and showing them how that relates to their lived experience. You can do that with almost anything if you understand it enough. But like we were showing with the Hegelian e-girl thing, like we're showing with these people who just like being confused. There's people who like having lots of questions and like being confused and like seeing the most insane version of something, and they kind of collect that like shitty art. They put it around their house, like, look at this dumb shit I read. Wow, you know. And look, I fall into that too. I've read dumb shit, but it does feel like a waste of your mental capacity if that's all you're doing. Real people want real solutions to real problems. So the number 4 is, he said, the continued adoption of an outdated apparatus logic of the type to be found in political parties, which is not appropriate for a movement and a school of thought, as well as journalistic or editorial policy, and which led cadres to flee on account of problems with the apparatus. Like, they're just using a language that doesn't fit. And, you know, when we talked about the NJP, the collapse of the National Justice Party, on the live stream a lot ago, we said that, look, what you're taking is a very dynamic, decentralized affiliation network and trying to hammer it into an early 20th century military organization, a dictatorship, and it doesn't fucking work. You're trying to adopt a logic and a terminology that is ill-fitting for this emergent phenomena. And a lot of people want to do that because they think that leads to legitimacy. And we have to adorn ourselves in the regalia of something serious, but you're not letting the emergent phenomena sort of write itself in real time. You know, that's what kills it in the end. Number 5 here, he says, a certain ideological fossilization combined with the persistence of a rightist cultural attachment to sentimentalizing the past and the abandonment in many fields of the idea of radical thought. To this, we could add the contradiction between implicit Euro-imperial references and an explicitly Euro-pluralist or even immigrationist stance. The Nouvelle Droit presented itself as a pagan church, one, moreover, without a deity. But paganism, by its very nature, is unserviceable as a metapolitical banner, unlike Christianity, Islam, or Judaism. Interesting point. The pagan soul is an inner strength that must permeate all ideological and cultural expressions. It's the heart of a nuclear reactor. It is not something to be openly displayed through instrumental slogans. Interesting. Therein, you could actually see some kind of political synthesis between paganism and Christianity. I think that's what interested Fordyce and many others who understand that, look, you cannot surgically remove Christianity from the DNA of the West. It must be reconciled. And there's many different projects on what that looks like. However, this is a way to, like, if your paganism is necessarily individualistic, it's not something you like gather beneath as a banner, really. That's what he's saying anyway. So by reducing European culture to mere folklore, this is depreciated and dragged down to the level of primitive art so dear to Jacques Chirac. He introduces this idea that the new right, as he understood it, was becoming a bit too friendly to, he uses the term third-worldists. That's a term we've used. We did a Real Secret Coffee Hours episode on that, about the term third worldism. It's used as a pejorative. I get that. However, it does describe something real. There are people who, from their position, oftentimes as Europeans, are trying to broker relationships and friendships and allegiances with other nationalist causes, oftentimes like brown power or black power movements, who probably don't have their best interests in mind. You can call that third worldism. Third worldism meaning that anything that is hostile towards the Western, they might call it the global American empire, the GAE, the gay. They might call it the Great Satan. There's like, you'll see people in our spaces like white nationalists call America the Great Satan. Those are usually the people who are looking for third world enemies to America to ally with. That's why, like, you'll see like far right guys like really liking North Korea. Like, who gives a fuck about North Korea? And he goes on here, he says, no folk in history fights the same battle as other peoples. Every alliance is temporary. Besides, the very notion of the third world has crumbled. What we have are China, India, the future Muslim empire. The third world doesn't exist. Third worldism ignores actual history, the immigration and geopolitical pressures of the South against the North. What's worse, this misplaced third worldism has been accompanied by a disconcerting and naive pro-Islamic stance to which we all succumbed when an objective, aggressive, revanchist, and comprehensible threat was actually being posed by the Arab and Muslim world against Europe, seen as a land to be conquered. So again, sound familiar? Sound familiar that the new, exciting, young right is trying to embrace Islam? This has happened before, you know, and just recently. Like, we didn't even want to talk about this. Not to gloat, not to say, I told you so. We're beyond I told you so.
They parade me around like a goddamn polar bear. They say I'm demented and I invented the solar flare.
But really, the recent attacks and the nativist uprisings in Britain again, and basically the race war going on right now between white Britons and brown Muslims, it proves that, like, there was no, you know, anti-Israeli friendship there. Like, you were strange bedfellows because you had a momentary ally, but make no mistake, these Muslims want you fucking dead. They don't like you. They probably see Israelis and Jews as white. You're both their fucking enemy.
First up, I want to show you what's been happening in England, where they've had their worst riots in more than a decade. They were triggered in large part by the alleged stabbing murder of those 3 young girls in Southport in the north of England, but all sorts of antagonism has come to the fore here, racism and antagonism towards immigrants. Here's the latest from Sky News UK.
Wave after wave, as violence descended. Scenes across the country now at risk of becoming normalised. Among the worst, Liverpool, parts of it set on fire, including a library.
A hotel housing asylum seekers, targeted by rioters. Smashing a window and trying to storm in. The group also targeted the officers trying to protect the building. Their weapons, anything they could get their hands on.
And we could spend a lot of time on this. This deserves to be its own segment. We could spend probably half the episode just on the recent clashes in Britain over the slaying of those 3 young girls and the injury of many, many others at that Taylor Swift concert, the perpetrator of which being a brown recent immigrant, as far as I know. And there was some confusion early on. But I guess that's the point I was making, which is, if you look at this young man who carried out this attack, no motive has been proven, but there doesn't need to be. Everyone knows the motive. Everyone on the ground understands what this is, because the propaganda machine from the British state apparatus kicked into gear. And the funny thing about that propaganda machine is it's the same one they've been using in the exact same template for years, for as long as I can remember. Anytime there's a terrorist attack, anytime there is a slaying, a killing, they will, you know, they did the same with Trayvon Martin. they'll wallpaper over his recent stuff. They'll show an old photograph of him when he's at school in a fucking gown of some kind, graduation, and say name some characteristics of a child. He was precocious. He was short. He liked to smile, but then you contrast that against whatever the recent photo taken from the trial was, like this individual who's dead-eyed, giant nappy hair, laughing in court when they're recounting his crimes, a vile subhuman creature. And the news was, they were trying to say, the assumption was he was Muslim. Turns out he might have been Christian, and there's some debate about that. However, that doesn't matter, because white Britons, and I say white because I'm not even classifying it based on religion, they understood that this is a brown invader. That's how they see it. And that's not uncalled for, because all of the brown Muslims gathered around this individual, this child from a different religious background. Why did they do that? Why have there been gangs of brown people masked up with machetes attacking white people, just civilians in the street, unrelated? I've seen 2 videos of white people being beaten with Palestinian flags, or Palestinian flags in the frame. So this is a race war. Otherwise, there will be no reason for people to automatically click into place on what the battle lines are and who the enemies are. That's what's happening. And I'm going to say something, and I'm not targeting anyone in particular when I say this. If anything, I'm targeting myself. And this is a thought that just occurred as we saw the latest atrocity, the latest 3 innocent young white girls who were targeted, obviously because they are white, obviously because they are natives, right? That's why every single time, that's why it fucking happens. We know that. The propaganda stops working over time. We've seen a gradation of reaction to the propaganda, and this is just the latest one, because it actually doesn't matter what the propaganda machine says, because people aren't listening. They're not buying into it. They're getting their information from elsewhere. So they'll have to either evolve the propaganda, evolve the narrative, or this will keep happening. Anyway, the point being that my sense when I read about this is I felt partially responsible. That sounds crazy because I'm Canadian. I don't live there, right? And what's my responsibility there? But I think in that sense, it's all of our faults, because I do believe what we say is correct. The things we believe, the values we hold, the things we pronounce, the policies, everything we say. We say it because we believe in it, at great risk to our careers and our freedom and our friendships and our family. A lot of us are out here risking quite a bit just saying these things, especially in Canada. We can be imprisoned oftentimes for the things we have said, and it has happened. But I do think it's inevitable. And I think it's inevitable not in a Marxist sense, where you say that the internal contradictions of a system or the logical fallacies will lead to an inevitable collapse. I don't think it's a system like that. But I do believe in the cause and effect of it all. I do believe that, well, if you bring in millions of immigrants, it's going to do this to the economy. It's going to do this to the job market. Everything's going to get worse, obviously. And so that the collapse in that sense is inevitable. The negative outcomes have been inevitable, and we've been saying it. And, violence was always going to increase. And we've been saying that. However, it is interesting that more normal people are coming around to what we've been saying. The mainstream, despite our oppression, despite our censorship, is adopting a lot of our views. But I do see it as a point of failure if it really took these many people to die, for it to become unignorable. That means our discourse, our rhetoric, our persuasive abilities weren't good enough to prevent this. This righteous indignation required 3 innocent girls to be brutally murdered. And it feels like that's the natural response to all of this, but I do feel some responsibility that it had to get this far, that we failed if we let the inevitable occur without doing something. Well, Dimes, what could we have done? I don't know. I don't know. Maybe we couldn't have done anything. but I do feel like we are getting a participation trophy when people say you were right at this point, and they never say we were right, but if they ever do, it's we came in second place. We lost the race against the total fucking downfall, and we had to let the most heinous acts slap people in the face, grab them by their fucking throat. I don't want to hear anyone with this like one struggle shit anymore. If you say that you're my enemy at this point, if you can look at that and say, this is just the Jews trying to divide us, fuck you. Anyway, and this is what he's saying. It's like, look, we were naive to think that we could have all these Islamic allegiances. We opened the fucking doors to these ideas, and where the fuck did it get us? Where did it get the Nouvelle Droit, all this pro-Islamic and third-worldism? Are they really popular? Did they get a lot of funding from Islamist groups? Anyway. Did they publish this? How many Islamic publishers published like the fucking Elements? Did they publish La de Benoit?
Yeah, nothing. Not in English or anything that's been translated, no.
The contemporary communitarian and multiculturalist discourse of the Nouvelle Droit can be interpreted as a sort of fatalism, for it sees the ethnic kaleidoscope of Europe, multiracial society, and immigration as inelucutable events we should accept and submit to, managing and putting up with them as best we can. Sound familiar? Sound like Castizo Futurism? Sound more like, look, these people are going to take on this cause better than these fucking pathetic losers over here. This has happened before. And then he goes on to describe more what he's proposing. He says, I would term Vitalist Constructivism an overall ideological framework that unites an organic and daring approach to life with the complementary worldviews of Nietzschean will to power, Roman order, and realist Hellenic wisdom. So I think that's a good summary of like, what's he talking about? What the fuck is Archeofuturism? Nietzscheanism, Roman order, and Hellenic wisdom. Okay. The second axis may be defined as Archeofuturism, to envisage a future society that combines techno-scientific progress with a return to traditional answers that stretch back into the mists of time. Okay, interesting. The ancients must be associated not with the moderns, but with the futurists. Okay. Third axis, to envisage the death throes of the European nation state and European revolution as the central political events of the 21st century. This implies the need to jump on the wagon of unification, if for no other reason than to correct the faults of, to use Lenin words, is useful idiots who are building the EU. A series of macro lines of catastrophe are converging towards a breaking point situated somewhere in the early 21st century. So he's saying, this is kind of what we were talking about with Iran. It's like, okay, is World War III happening right now? No. Is it going to happen next week? No. It does seem inevitable in the short term if the various intersecting paths actually do converge, right? The advocating for war and on both sides, and then the circumstantial conflicts going on right now, like there will reach a point of inevitability. So he's saying like that is going to define the 21st century. An environmental, economic, and military apocalypse brought about by faith in miracles, including the belief that development can continue indefinitely without posing the risk of general collapse. Now, that's interesting as well. That's the acceleration movement as far as I'm concerned. This belief in infinite growth. This belief that NVIDIA stock will just keep climbing forever because AI is going to climb forever as well, won't it? Right? He says the egalitarian civilization sprung from modernity is now witnessing its last good days. We must now think about the aftermath of the catastrophe. We must already start developing the vision of an archaeofuturist world for the aftermath of the chaos. The fifth axis of this whole worldview, the fifth axis, to think about the conflict between North and South that is emerging, a possible third world war, and the role Islam may assume as a symbolic banner of revenge. And think about that. Think about the global South allying generally with Islam as one coherent bloc promoting revenge against Western imperialism. I could see that. I am seeing that. The sixth axis, related to the first, is the United States. Is the United States an enemy? A debilitating rival on the cultural and economic level? Is it more dangerous in the South? I believe we are now closer to, and this is where he might deviate a bit from some, he sees themselves closer to the Russians, our former absolute enemies, than we are with the Americans, our former absolute friends. So one thing that he proposes in this book, and he makes more solid proposals near the end, it's that embracing Russia, embracing Eastern Europe, of course, but also embracing Russia, which has never really seen itself as Western. I do see Russia as a distinct geopolitical entity, but he's saying the future for Europe is allying with Russia and creating what he calls Euro-Siberia, which sounds a lot like when one of the Real Secret Coffee Hours, we were discussing Substack for the Euro-Eurabianism movement. So right now there's a lot of people saying we can combine Europe with this. We can combine Europe with Russia or with Arabia, which will, I guess, constitute the real wealth and intelligence of this new bloc. But yeah, he's saying, let's just expand into Russia. So I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that, but he says a few things that I don't agree with in here. I could probably get to those right now. I know we got to get going soon, but yeah, he gives a few policy positions here where he says, here are a few common sense suggestions for education. Schools should no longer be compulsory above the age of 14. It should teach the keys to knowledge and rules of social conduct through discipline. It should follow 3 principles: selection based on merit, reward, and punishment. It should also have a degree of solemnity to it. Yep. Hey, reasonable.
Love it.
Most people wouldn't disagree with that. Right? Then he goes into music. Right? He says, from a musical point of view, rap, like techno, is a very poor genre. He actually spends a while just complaining about rap and techno. It's a poor genre. It is not open to any renewal. Its range of harmonies is too small, and its rhythms too repetitive. Its lyrics, written by talentless people with public funding, are worthless, plaintive, and falsely violent, utter imposters. The same goes for all contemporary rappers. MC Solar is a good writer of lyrics trapped in a musical deadlock. So I like that he also gives rappers he likes. Here's an interesting one. The hardest blow that could be dealt to the sex industry would be to make brothels legal again, with medical checkups compulsory. Organized legal prostitution is the best known way to channel deviant sexual energies. That's...
How about just punishing people? How about that instead?
That's the thing. And also, that ties into the next thing. It says, on a planetary level, it's quite clear that there is a will to allow the lucrative drug business to thrive and to manage it. The system has no intention of curbing the traffic in drugs.
So will is like we went from...
See this, I wanted to give the balance here where he talks about a lot of things I agree in, but then it's a lot of like, well, of course, be very libertarian
people
about
want
drugs.
To have drugs. So.
Yeah. So of course we should just do that and brothels, and then, but you can very quickly get to a cascade of degeneracy from that. It's like, look, there's good kids want to trans.
This I don't fault him. This is it's a really common thing. The guy's got a really great foundational concept that he's been playing with, that he's been writing this book about for years and years. And then at the end, he's kind of pushing through. And it's like, all right, now what are some policy positions? Maybe the editor even asked him to put that in. And he's like, fuck, all right, what would we do? And this stuff is so half-baked in comparison to what he had been writing about before. Like, we should just legalize brothels. Like, dude, that's like almost the opposite of what you were just talking about.
Also, some people just have no opinion. Like, I've never used a prostitute, so it's like, if people want it, fine. Just don't have people getting AIDS. Can we stop AIDS? This is not interesting to me. And some people look at transgenderism like that. I'm like, yeah, it's dumb. Maybe the people who should be trans should cut their dicks off. Let them. But
people who have an opinion like that should not be allowed to have opinions. You shouldn't be allowed to talk. If you can be a quote unquote single issue voter, you can look at something as broad as prostitution, abortion, trans rights, and say that, well, that doesn't matter to me because I'm X guy. Go fuck yourself. If you're not broad enough to understand all of these things and how they interrelate, you're relegated to the fucking kids table forever. Shut up.
It just means you haven't really thought that much about it, but it also is, quintessentially French. he cannot escape.
It is really French.
It's right.
Drugs and hookers. I mean, I'm French. What do you
want? Drugs and hookers. There should be free whores and wine. And like, there's always going to be free whores and wine in left, right. I don't care what the fuck it is. It's baguettes, no matter what. I don't care the shape of the palace. It's a swastika. It's a hammer and sickle. It's all made of baguettes. Just to give some definitional terms here, he says, archaic does not mean backwards looking, for it is the historical past that has engendered the egalitarian philosophy of modernity that is now falling to ruin, and hence any form of historical regression would be absurd, which is good. Like, you can't go, even if we could go back, the sequence of events would probably still occur the way they have. Like, how far back do you go back where you won't eventually end up here anyway? You can't just go back and remain in stasis, right? Our current of thought has always been torn and weakened by an artificial distinction contrasting traditionalists with those who look towards the future. Archeofuturism can reconcile these two families through a dialectical overcoming. The future, as opposed to a historical cycle that's repeating itself, is what lies at the center of the European worldview. Interesting. The Archeofuturist synthesis as a philosophical alliance between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Hence the paradox of Archeofuturism, which rejects all ideas of progress, as everything pertaining to the worldview of a people must rest on unchangeable basis, which makes sense. Like, you must build on a base of, we call them first principles, but they could be ancient values too. You can't define yourself as change, which is the iron, that's the flux we live in right now under liberalism. Like, well, we must always be progressing. It's progress for the sake of progress, but it's not bounded by anything. He says, over the past 50,000 years, Homo sapiens has changed very little, and archaic and pre-modern models of social organization have proven valid. The fallacious idea of progress must be replaced with movement. Sounds like distinction without a difference, but I do think there's something there.
Honestly, it's at a glance, it sounds like he's distilled the worst parts of progress into its own thing.
Yeah, and he says Archeofuturism distinguishes itself from conventional traditionalism because of its approach to technological science, which it does not demonize. For the essence of technological science is not connected to egalitarian modernity, but rather has its roots in the ethno-cultural heritage of Europe, and particularly ancient Greece.
Nope, that's not true though. No, that's not right. Anyway, I'll carry on, but like that's just not true.
Where would you? So just I can give you a second there just to go into that.
Saying that would you say like the scientific method is totally disconnected from egalitarian liberalism or whatever else, and therefore you can combine it directly with traditionalism? No, you can't. You can't. It is actually directly tied. The science, like scientism, came directly out of egalitarian liberalism. The idea that I, as an individual man, am, you're kind of sneaking in there. I'm greater than God. I can look at the universe. I can figure this out, and I'm going to explore. And I'm not saying that is bad. But what you're doing there is the exact opposite of traditionalism. You're saying I can second guess my ancestors, I can second guess the rules, I can second guess common knowledge, and I can create a new thing which is better than what we already have. It is literally the antithesis to conservatism and traditionalism. So I'm not saying no. I'm just saying to say that we can just marry that. No, they're two different things. They're two very different.
I will say, when we discussed the book The Crisis of the European Mind by Paul Hazard, that was basically what that book was about. It wasn't so much that scientism it wasn't that the scientific revolution followed liberalism, but liberalism followed the scientific revolution.
Yes.
Scientific revolution kind of came first, then that gave birth to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment followed. Then what that birthed was liberalism and rationalism, the development of rationalism as a sort of endless critique of society that came out of the Enlightenment. That wasn't the Enlightenment, but that grew from it. So those are links in the same chain, but that
you can't just say you can have one without the other. You can have one without the other for a time, but you have to always be on guard that this isn't going to crop up again, because it's gonna.
I think there's something to the idea, and this is sort of what Marshall McLuhan was talking about, that I don't think the Western mind, the European mind, it can ever be traditional in the same way we think of tribes, or like there's something to be said that we were always doomed to this. We were always doomed because what were we talking about? Might have been Rene Guénon. Oh, you know what it was? I think it was even that book about like Hyperborean stuff. It was about the idea we've always embraced linear time over cyclical time in Europe. Some people say that came from our understanding of logos through Christianity, but I would argue it came differently. But the idea that we see our presence in the universe and the sequence of time differently than we do, different than the Indians do, different than a lot of the pre-modern people might do. So that alone might have doomed us to developing a different Cartesian placement of ourselves in relation to God and the universe. Like maybe we were always doomed to invent liberalism, which is an interesting idea because that means that only we could work our way out of liberalism and secular humanism. It can never be these other outside traditionalists.
And not to go too deep into this, but I view the creation of liberalism in the same way that I view drugs and prostitution. It's a thing that we've now realized. This is like a new epoch in history where we've gone through it for the first time. And we realize that it's dangerous. There's bad parts about it, but it's something that's always going to be in our nature, and we have to guard against it to infinity, forever. So we're just going to build that into our culture now, where we're never going to do that again, and here's why. The same reason that we don't break up families, and that we don't pay for sex, and that we don't do ayahuasca, we also don't do liberalism. Liberalism is poison, and it will kill you, so don't. And if you do it, you're a pariah. We might not kill you, but you're a pariah, and you're not allowed in town. So
yeah, he goes on here. He says the future is not the negation of tradition and historical memory of a folk, but rather their metamorphosis, by which they are ultimately reinforced and regenerated. Archeofuturism is a concept of order, a concept that upsets modern minds, which are shaped by the fallacious individualist ethics of emancipation and the rejection of discipline that has led to the swindle of contemporary art and wreaked havoc on the educational socioeconomic systems. So again, one of the reasons I wanted to follow our look into vitalism with this, which is like, okay, here's an interesting attempt to do what I think Costin was doing, which is like trying to reconcile this ancient mode of man that everyone kind of feels in their bones, that the current way that men live is compromised, feminized, weak. Like we want to return to something. There was an earlier form that made more sense. But trying to reconcile that with this sense that technological advancement seems to be inevitable unless it reaches a total cataclysm scenario, which we can't even really guide. It's like an entity that is inventing itself in real time. That's where you get into the sort of Nick Landian hyperstition stuff, which is like, is this an organism that's just creating itself from the future? Really, really crazy stuff like that. But, there is a sense that we need to look backwards to find something to guide this in the future to make it so it's not just this dysgenic catastrophe. So this is almost just a different version of what came before. And we might not even agree with it. There's a few things here that I think we both disagree with. But I do like the admission of, we can feel good about the future. We can feel like we have a hand in guiding the future. The future itself is not our oppressor. We can help write it. But to do that, we need to believe in, like we were always talking about first principles, but it could just be that which has been emergent, right? The Industrial Revolution really gave birth, in my mind, to the concept of ideology. Ideology as being a scientific system that you can use to reorganize society from the top down. And this is done by fascists, by communists, by liberals, everyone. Everyone secretly thinks they could centrally plan society in a new way. But I think what he is saying, I had to phrase it another way, is that we need to return to what has been emergent, what seems to have been organically generated over time, not through some scheme to create a utopia. And I think just as one other first principle, believing that which came before probably has more validity and value than what you can come up with now. Just always err on the side of that, you know? Like people will say, well, why not have 20 different genders? It's like, no, because that's new and probably bad. At the very least, this is proven. At the very least, we understand that man plus woman equals family makes sense. Any deviation from that should be treated with suspicion. That's just a good way to go about things, right? Men being the head of the household, that seems to make sense because that's been tried and tested. Matriarchal societies lead you down strange paths. That leads you down to fucking witch moms and various forms of Kabbalah. Anyway, so that's what he's saying. Like, always look towards what has been emergent through your ancestors, but use that to chart a course towards the future. Move towards the future. Don't look at it as a cycle to continually just inhabit as a form of stasis, which is another form of utopianism. I think that's what he's getting at. That's kind of a rambling summary. So there's a bit more in here, but I really think that captures the concept of Archeofuturism, which is marrying traditionalism to futurism. Sounds like a crazy idea, but I don't know. I think
I like it overall. I've got that actually on my hard drive, so I'm gonna read that.
Yeah, there's a lot more in here. There's a lot more defensive technology. But some of the stuff we've talked about before, I really like the description of the Front National and Nouvelle Droit politics. That stuff interests me, and just the parallels that can be drawn. You know, the embrace of third worldism, the falling back into theory for the sake of theory, just them dealing with their own economy of takes and forgetting that, look, the only reason that we're discussing any of this is because we want to move in a direction. If you're just involved in discourse without a direction, without an orientation, you're dying. Not only are you just killing yourself, you're not interesting to anyone, any real people.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.